All right, so moving right along, let's see what we have next. Share the screen. All right, so we're going to talk about intersectionality in a transnational world. So this is a Pat Hill Collins, sorry, or Patricia Hill Collins. She is an influential sociologist who has been one of the most prominent proponents and people who use this idea of intersectionality within their work and has really theorized on it a great deal. Kimberly Crenshaw is the human that is coined with that idea. However, Pat Hill Collins is the person within sociology and within that framework that is talked about the most and has used it throughout the most within the most spaces. Okay, so this piece is really talking about the transnational world, about how we need to branch intersectionality out to understand things. Again, with context, right? Context is key here. And we're going to do that through the ideas of transnational spaces and religions. And I'm going to walk you through that pretty quickly because this one, again, is touching on a lot of the ideas that we've already talked about, but we're really going to hone in on these two frameworks of traditional spaces, our transnational spaces and religions. And this was, again, working towards that extension of this intersectionality framework and how it might be utilized as we research. In transnational spaces, we need to understand that race operates globally very different than it operates just in one country singularly, right? Okay, so when we talk about race in America, it is a very hierarchical structure that is very deemed, it's deemed very differently than maybe if you say went to India, that has a very different hierarchical structure to their race, and to their categories of race are going to look very differently. Now, those hierarchies still tend to put maybe darker skinned individuals in a lower context. However, they do it in very different ways, right? And that colorism looks very different. Now, in the same token, you might go to Africa and some parts of Africa where having darker skin is racially dominant, right? Is the dominant category, is the category of preference. And so we need to understand that race doesn't operate singularly throughout the globe. However, as we enter these transnational spaces, the context of power and the context of what, who's holding these transnational spaces does impact how that is presented. And really, when you talk about media and transnational spaces, this is a great example of this, right? So when we're talking about how maybe social media, for instance, is incredibly globally networked, right? What is advertised on social media and what media outlets and what things are projected there, especially when you project predominantly European social understandings or social worlds as important, what you end up getting is this very, is highlighting that racial structure, the racial hierarchy within America or within that European context and projecting it transnational. And so depending on what those spaces are, you're going to end up with very contextually, like you're going to carry that hierarchy, or that hierarchy is going to be different because that transnational space really is dependent on someone else's power or someone else's hosting, if that makes sense. And so we're going to also talk about how marginalization through lack of access. So within those transnational spaces, again, if you don't have access to those transnational spaces, that in and of itself is another marginalization that people are going to experience, especially more prominently as we move towards this more global outlook in the world. So even when you look at maybe COVID response, right, or we do research on public health in this growing crisis, you're going to see a very different understanding of a fight depending on where you're at, right? So like you see a lot of news right now about how pushing for boosters for vaccines or something might be something that the US or other European countries are talking about. Well, you have the World Health Organization, which is talking about a transnational space, really emphasizing this idea that, wait a minute, we have places in the globe that don't have the original vaccine. You all are talking boosters to get rid of a global pandemic when you're not talking about all these other pockets that are going to continue to have issues and continue to perpetuate these variants because we can't get access to vaccines in the same ways, right? So these transnational spaces impact the other spaces that even when they're not in those discussions, right? And so really having these conversations about how those spaces operate and what is dominant and the messaging that is behind those is important. And that's part of talking about intersectionality. Also, when we're talking about this, it's also that ability to take, like, as an immigrant, maybe take some of those networking or some of those social groups that allow you the space to feel resilient, to feel empowered with you into a different national space that maybe make you feel very less empowered. The ability to have access to that resiliency, to those pockets of the world where you are not in a necessarily marginalized position, allows you to contextualize those intersections within your life, right? And allow you to have that ability to branch into those opportunities or like deal with or foster some of that resilience to deal with the marginalization you might have in other places. But really looking at how those things are granted, like those transnational spaces are garnering opportunities and also changing and flipping the scripts on hierarchical structures. And I think that those things are important. And Collins does a really good job of kind of giving you multiple examples of what I'm talking about. Religion is another idea, right? Religion-based discrimination happens regularly in any part of the world, but just because that religion may be discriminated against in one place in the world doesn't mean that that's not the dominant in another place in the world. So talking about that religion, and again, so we can talk about Muslim Americans here, right? Okay, so, or Muslim immigrants that come to America. That idea that this nationality, this race, this religion became this basis for this terrorist or threat ideology isn't necessarily reflective of other parts of the world where Muslim religion is the dominant example of what religion is. And so within those hierarchical structures, right, that's going to be maybe the top, whereas, or maybe within like other societies, you might have, or other parts of the world, you may have Christianity as not being the dominant part. But in America, that is the dominant space. Understanding again that ability to take an idea on a religion and your religious ideology and make it a marginalization or another identity that does that intersection and weaving within that social hierarchy and within that social structure is really what Collins is talking about. It's really like, hey, religious identity is also something that's interplaying, is also something that's having these impacts, is also something that we need to talk about. And it's also something that, as we're talking about these transnational spaces, very much differs depending on where you are globally. And so really that's what this entire article is about. If you get nothing out of it, it's understanding that globally hierarchies work different. And so any identity that you may have in one part of the globe may be very differently positioned in another part of the globe for various reasons. And being able to maybe tap into, as a marginalized person in one area where you are dominant, that allows you to have maybe some resistance or resilience to that marginalization in the place that you are currently operating. So that's kind of what this article is really what I want you to get out of it. But again, there are really detailed and good examples of what it is we're talking about here. So make sure you read it. It's a fairly short read and it really emphasizes how identities can operate very differently. And we can talk about that in length when it comes to gender as well, operating very differently globally or culturally. Okay. All right. So I hope you're having a great day. I hope you're getting through these fairly quickly. And that all your assignments are turned in. But I will talk to you next time and we're going to go over, I think we have one more left. Yes, the masculinity piece. And then we're going to talk about some of the optional stuff and things we need to get through for this module. So hang in there. We've got 2 more lectures and then we're done. All right. I will talk to you next time.